So let's talk about one very strong objective scoring special rule, and why a huge amount of strong armies choose to include it, at least in small numbers, in their lists. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 40k gameplay, and in this video I thought we'd take a focused look at the objective secured type rule, which as mentioned for a whole bunch of armies seems to be sort of in borderline auto-include kind of territory. It's just very common to see, say, Space Marine lists take one small unit of intercessors, guard armies take a squad of Cadian shock troops along, sisters take a battle sister squad split by an immolator, or world eaters take some jackals. Generally speaking, if you've got access to it in a fairly cheap unit, it's just a very tempting thing to add in. And while it might feel just a little bit unobtrusive and not really all that outwardly powerful compared with big flashy damage dealing special rules, I thought in this video we could talk through how it works, a few examples of how it might be used, and all the potential advantages that it could give you in earning more victory points on your primary objectives in games of 40k. There's some things that feel very obvious, but others maybe just a little bit less so, either from a game planning or turn-to-turn tactic sort of basis that might not be the most straightforward thing for newer players out there. Jumping straight into the rule though, let's talk about how it works first. And these objective secured or sticky objectives type rules tend to be most commonly a datasheet rule, but occasionally they might trigger on either stratagems or detachment rules and things. A typical wording for it is this: at the end of your command phase, if this unit is within range of an objective marker that you control, that objective marker remains under your control even if you have no models within range of it, and this effect lasts until the opponent controls the objective, and the rules might vary a little bit there. A fair few of them say at the start or end of any turn, though quite a few of them say at the end of any phase. I guess technically the start or end of turn one is a little bit more powerful than the phase one, though it doesn't often matter too much. In general, the idea is move your squad onto an objective, hold that objective, and basically usually you have to survive for a turn to get through to your next command phase, and that essentially means that you plant a flag in that objective and it remains yours, so if your unit should then get shot down or move off to do something else, then it still remains under your control, and until your opponents can move a unit to go and claim that objective, it'll be yours and keep on generating you primary victory points across the game. I guess the biggest fundamental advantage of it is that essentially you can hold an objective without actually having to use a unit to hold that objective, which you might not necessarily always be able to, but when you can it's quite a big advantage, as that unit can go and do other things and add utility elsewhere, whether it's damage or screening or anything else. For a fairly straightforward rule, I feel like all the ways that it can be helpful maybe aren't super obvious. There's lots of different ways that you can look at it for different units that might trigger it, and rounding things up together it feels like there's maybe 4 different ways that it can be directly useful. First up, and one of the most obvious ones, is that if your unit's destroyed on the objective by a shooting attack and your opponent doesn't have anything nearby, usually that'd be a big deal and you'd lose the victory points for the objective. But if you manage to hold it with a sticky objective style unit, that's not going to be a counterplay, so you might have lost the unit, but they're still going to have value even after they've died by the flag that they planted in the point. Maybe a good example could be Chaos Cultists moving forward to claim a mid-board point for a turn. They manage to survive and score that point for Chaos in your turn 2, then in the enemy turn 2 some intercessors turn up and shoot them down with their bolters, but then the Chaos player still scores the objective in turn 3 as the Space Marines couldn't get anything close enough to actually take the flag down. This could also happen on a home objective as well. Maybe those same Chaos Cultists are in defense of your starting objective. The Space Marine player drops some Inceptors down just outside of 6 inches and erases the Cultist from the board. But because they couldn't actually drop on the objective remains the Chaos player's one, and then makes that whole move just a lot less valuable, as it could well be worth it if it both kills a unit and also denies victory points, but might well not be worth it if all you're doing is trading some Inceptors for some Cultists. It should also work against indirect fire as well as a ward against that. If the same Cultists are wiped off the board by some mortars, then the objective is still yours, and again it makes it a lot less point in actually bothering to fire all the indirect at that unit, as they'll still have claimed the points dead or alive. Otherwise, the other more obvious one is that it basically means that your units, rather than just sitting around claiming the points, can go and be aggressive, and there's various different ways that you can look at that, but basically if you have a unit that has some alright damage output, not having to make the difficult decision between staying on the point and scoring it, or charging down the next enemy unit could be quite big, provided the opponent can't get anything to take down your flag. For 3 different takes on this, first up you could have some aggression on the mid board. Maybe the Orc player moves up, charges and kills a unit on a midfield objective with the boys, they survive to score the point next turn, and then rather than just sitting around doing objective work, they can then move on to take down the next enemy unit. Perhaps for example if there was another enemy infantry unit that was say 12 inches away from them or something like that, they could get value from their damage output if they charge down that unit and even just lock it in place, even if they don't kill it. Still, by charging it, it means that it won't be moving up to charge you and take your point. This one could be particularly helpful late game as well, when the opponent might not have quite so many units on the board, being able to abandon a midfield point and then throw everything onto the next ones to destroy enemy units and take the next objective. You could also look at that from a home field objective perspective as well. Say for example a World Eaters player has tasked some Jackals with holding their home board objective, they've put down their sticky objectives rule on it, and then maybe the other player puts down a unit in their deployment zone, maybe to score some secondaries and deal a bit of damage. For example, an Eldari player puts some swooping Hawks down here, shoots some of the Jackals dead but not all of them, and then it's the World Eaters player's turn. If they're the only thing on an objective, then their sticky objective rule means that you could quite happily go and counter-attack the swooping Hawks, charge the squad down, hopefully kill as many as possible or at least lock them in place. If possible, you might even be able to chain them out a touch so they could consolidate back onto the objective if you think you're actually going to wipe out the enemy squad. But either way, it means that you don't have to compromise between dealing damage and scoring your home field, which could be awkward for a different unit just sat there. Otherwise, for the sort of damage and utility thing, you could look at it in a very different way and maybe say you've tasked a unit for holding your home field objective, and then later on in the game they're going to use their might for a late game push towards mid-board objectives. Perhaps for one good example, we could have Azrael and a unit of Dark Angel's Intercessors. They sit on the home board for the first few turns, Azrael generating command points and adding value there, and then he can react to how things are going in the game later. If the opponent's tried to assail your home objective, then you've got something decently fighty there, but otherwise you can see how the battle's going, and if it makes sense just to have them secure your objective against all threats in the later turns, they can do so. But if the opponent doesn't look like they're going to threaten your home objective, and perhaps don't have anything that can get around the flanks of you, or everything that could has been killed, you might be able to take Azrael and the Intercessor squad, move them towards the midfield, and start dealing damage with bolt rifles with sustained hits, and then putting Azrael's melee profile to work. Basically, you've got a unit that's secured the home field, and then can continue to secure the home field even after they've moved off it. And then you've got a unit with some melee threat and a whole bunch of OC to maybe charge something down in the mid-board, stop the enemy scoring it, or take it for yourself, as well as just taking a chunk of damage out of stuff. That could work quite well for other units as well. Maybe another good example for that could be a Astra Militarum command blob, perhaps some Cadian shock troops with Ursula Crees and a command squad attached. For most of the game they can sit on the home field, making sure it's not threatened, while Creed throws out orders to everyone and some freer stratagems, and then late game they can do a push towards the mid-board with a whole bunch of OC2 models, and Creed using move to get the unit quickly up to a midfield objective, then maybe charge something there and swing one of those objectives as a turn, maybe dealing some damage as a last gasp to get more points. Maybe in a similar sort of vein for units moving off objectives, you could get value by units moving off objectives to do other things as well as just deal damage. Maybe deep strike screening could be a potential. Say you've got a guard unit here with some Cadians and a Lehman Russ next to the home objective. The Cadians have got their objective secured sticky objectives rule on it, and then maybe they could choose to move away to block off more of your home fields to enemies arriving outside of 9 inches. Between them and a nearby Lehman Russ, nothing can arrive on the home field objective. It's completely screened out. And then if something chooses to arrive on the far side of the Cadian shock troops, even if they charge and kill them, then the objective's still going to be yours as well, as they'll just have arrived their troops and be sitting on a place that isn't the home field objective, so won't be able to swing it. You could also potentially use this if units need to be in slightly different locations to go and do secondary objectives as well, maybe. Overall, quite a lot of different ways to look at that, but I'd say the two primary ways are those mentioned, having units shot down and then the objective remains yours, and then various different flavours of moving off the objective to do damage or get more utility like screen or do secondaries. Otherwise, maybe the other two slightly more niche examples could be if your unit fails Battleshock, usually not the biggest factor in 10th edition games, but occasionally it matters. Say for example, if you had Emperor's Children guarding your home field with some Tormentors, the objective's going to be theirs regardless of whether or not they're on it or whether or not they have any OC this turn, so if the Tyrannid player uses Shadow in the Warp and forces a bunch of failed leadership across the board, even if the Tormentors fail, the objective is still yours. It could be relevant just for regular Battleshock as well, if you took a bunch of casualties and had the chance of failing. This one's maybe going to be a bit random and scattergun though, probably more of a nice side benefit than one of the primary ones. Finally, maybe for the single most niche one I can think of, at least off the top of my head, if you wind up having an objective that's completely perfectly contested, and the OC just happens to finally balance out between you and your opponent, it means you'd still have the objective claimed. This one's definitely pretty niche, but does happen from time to time. Say for example if you had 2 intercessors left on an objective, and then the opponent's got an OC4 battle tank that they could contest the objective with and deny you scoring, the point will still remain yours if you'd deployed the rule on it. Just every so often it could matter big, but I guess a nice side benefit of having those points locked down. Overall, between all those potentials, there's just a whole load of draw to having at least one unit with that rule in your army if it's readily available and the unit isn't too expensive. In general, it tends to be most valuable on cheap units. Maybe good examples could be those Chaos Cultists, where it's almost auto-include for 50 points, or perhaps Leagues of Votann Hearthkin Warriors split in half with some Sagittars. The same for Cabalite Warriors with Venoms, or a single squad of Space Marine Intercessors, anything like that. It does seem like it's quite a powerful way to incentivize taking at least some of the faction's troops, which usually tend to be the ones that have it. It means that the unit doesn't necessarily have to be the biggest damage dealer to have a really good impact on the game. To do what you'd imagine they might be doing in the lore, fighting over the objectives with that being their main focus, and it means they can still have lots of value even if they're not the best damage dealers like the faction's elites are supposed to be. It does mean that you can get diminishing returns though. After you've taken one squad, the second squad with the rule is less useful because it's just going to have less choice of where to put things. It definitely doesn't mean that you couldn't have loads of them if it made sense to otherwise for the army, but if you're primarily buying them in for the special rule, the first squad has the most value, then the second squad will have slightly less, unless the unit's just outright very efficient in its own right in a damage and defense way or has other utility. There's plenty of units that can combine it with various different special rules as well. Say for example Grey Knight Strike squads with their teleporting around the table, that's just really nice for them. Putting the rule down on the home objective and then maybe try and warp to somewhere in the midfield to lay it down again. There's plenty of other rules that aren't just datasheet ones that can allow you to trigger it. Chaos Knights might like their Aura of Terror enhancement for a knight. That one's at least a fairly common one to see on a War Dog Stalker in a War Dog spam list. You can use that to mark the home field objective to give you options as to whether you have to stay on it with a fighting knight or can move off. Maybe deploy it there and then have that same knight march towards the midfield to try and secure something. And it gives you a lot more options and makes your opponent's job in taking those points a bit harder. There's various different stratagems out there that can also give you bonus effects, like the Vanguard one that can deal some mortal wounds when enemies take the objective, a nice little side benefit there, or the Death Guard detachment rule that both gives you the sticky objectives for the whole army, and also makes them contagions of Nurgle things, so you might be able to debuff units nearby as well. Finally, for maybe a particularly helpful example of the special rule, there's some stratagems that can allow you to trigger sticky objectives when the unit gets shot down. A good example could be the World Eater's Blood Offering in their Berserker Warbands. You could have a unit of Jackals that get sticky objectives anyway, move them onto a central objective, and then even if that objective's right in the open, if the opponent doesn't move something up to contest or charge them down, then basically that objective is going to be yours no matter what in the next phase. If they don't wipe the unit, then it's yours anyway, and you'll have sticky objectives on it for future turns. If they do shoot down the unit with a bunch of guns, then you can use the one command point Blood Offering stratagem, and the point will still be yours anyway, unless they've been able to get something dead close. That could also be really problematic with Khorne Berserkers and Blood Surge moves, as you don't really want to have token things next to them, as you won't be able to afford to put things close and just shoot them if you can't stand up to them in melee. This one often could be just a very guaranteed route to still score victory points, or an objective that you've just contested with something sacrificial. Overall, it's certainly a powerful rule, plenty of good ways to put it into armies, and Games Workshop does seem to have gone through most of the factions in the game and making sure that they can access it, at least in some kind of way, which I think is kind of nice with those sort of utility things. They seem to be trying to make most armies have access to things like scouts and infiltrate, at least in some way, whether it's detachment rules or allies or anything like that, and sticky objectives is something that just about every faction in the game can get now. If you're using it just for a small single unit, it does mean that if you possibly can, it would be a good value to tow onto the home objective. You usually get one home one, and then the rest in the midfield. And then you either have the option of tasking them with screening and holding the home board point, which I think still makes sense, as that means that your opponent can't just move things up and literally claim it uncontested. They'd have to try and kill the unit as well. But it just means that you've got lots and lots of options for doing other stuff with it. As mentioned, charging to counter-attack things that get too close, moving out and spreading out to deep strike screen, or doing a late game push to try and commit more troops to the mid-board if you're fairly sure that the home is safe. Otherwise though, you could look at it at a different way, maybe just tow onto the objective and then task a different unit with the defense of the home field. Say have your Space Marine Intercessor squad tow onto the home objective so that's deployed round 1, and then immediately send them straight off to the mid-board, perhaps as a second wave behind your big damage dealers, and try and get that rule to work on a mid-board objective as well, and maybe have extra value from them there if they happen to survive, as I'm sure the opponent will be trying to deal with other things in your army. Overall, lots and lots of options for that. Let me know your thoughts as to the rule down in the comments below. Is it something that you have in your armies or not? Look forward to hearing all your takes as always. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to have new ones out just about every day. If you've been getting good value out of the videos on the channel, feel free to check out the Patreon page, links down in the video description. A big thank you to anyone supporting there. Certain videos do turn up early for preview on that one, and this will be one of them. There's a few other benefits to Patreon membership, occasional votes to see what sort of things come next, and entry to the channel's monthly prize giveaways as well. Check it out if you're interested, but in any case an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.